With Jamal Adams, the Seahawks secondary might finally be back, but at what cost? Real quick, if at any point you find yourself enjoying this video, and that is something you like to do, especially in a year like 2020, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and hopefully there will be some more things for you to enjoy in the future. Over the weekend, the Jamal Adams saga in New York finally came to an end, as the Jets agreed to trade him to the Seattle Seahawks. In exchange, the Jets will get safety Bradley McDougald, as well as the Seahawks' first and third round picks in 2021 and their first round pick in 2022. And the Seahawks will also get the Jets' fourth round pick in that 2022 draft. And for Seahawks fans, the obvious immediate reaction was an overwhelming level of excitement to finally have another All-Pro safety. But then we start to look at the cost of getting that All-Pro safety and started to wonder whether or not it was actually worth it, as it was definitely a very expensive acquisition. No, the Seahawks didn't get their All-Pro level player for a second round pick and the opportunity to get rid of a bad contract for a player whose best years are already behind him. But that's probably because Jamal Adams wasn't playing for the Texans. I mean, regardless of how good Adams is, there's no way around the fact that 2 firsts and a third, as well as a very good safety in and of himself in Bradley McDougald, is a very steep price to pay. But as far as I'm concerned anyway, it was absolutely worth it. In fact, I think this is a very good trade for the Seahawks. And it is also a very good trade for the Jets, who will absolutely want those picks as they continue to rebuild their team and try and get to a competitive level again. And I will get to why I think the Seahawks are getting more than just a really good safety out of this deal, but first let's go over what they paid for it. Now, the obvious focal point on the Seahawks side is those 2 first-round picks, and the easy and definitely more humorous way of justifying giving up 2 first-round picks for a safety is to point out that the Seahawks have not been very good at drafting in the first round. But there's no way around the fact that outside of the value of some good self-deprecating humor, that is just not a good reason to be giving up first-round picks. I mean, yes, it is probably worth mentioning that of the 8 first-round picks that Carroll and Schneider have had in now 11 drafts together, there have only been 8 Pro Bowls from those players while playing for the team. And all of those came from the 2010 draft, and 7 of them from Earl Thomas. I mean, yes, they did get some solid contributing players, but since 2010, with their best first-round pick probably being Bruce Irvin, who was definitely overshadowed by the 2 picks that came after him in Bobby Wagner and then Russell Wilson, it definitely hasn't been a glowing track record for the Seahawks in the first round. Now, that being said, I do think that Rashad Penny started to show some promise last season before his injury, even if he did have a pretty disappointing rookie season. Plus, it's definitely way too early to make any kind of definitive decision about LJ Collier, even after a disappointing first year, and Jordan Brooks, who hasn't even played yet. But when it comes to considering the value of first-round picks, you can't think about the value of the players that the team has taken in the past, and you have to think about the value of the picks themselves. And when it comes to the Seahawks and these next 2 first-round picks that they've given up, especially after acquiring a player like Jamal Adams who can massively improve their defense, those picks are very likely to come towards the end of the first round in the mid-20s, or maybe even in the 30s. And if that does prove to be the case, that'll put both of these picks solidly in the window that is the most overvalued set of picks in the entirety of the NFL draft. And that's because the first round is unlike any of the other rounds in the draft, especially in the disparity of talent within the round, with usually the top 10 or so picks being the absolute top level talent and true first round picks, while the later picks, especially like where the Seahawks will probably be, being much closer in talent to a mid-second round pick than they are to those top first round picks. It's a fact that's actually probably a large part of the reason of why people look at the Seahawks first round picks over the last few years and just think that they haven't been that good at drafting in the first round. Because since 2011, the Seahawks have only drafted above 25 once, and that was Bruce Irvin. And since 2016, the highest they've drafted is 27th. It's also probably a large part of the reason that between 2012 and 2016, the Seahawks traded out of the first round in every single one of those years. And honestly, probably the best example of the Seahawks using the value of a first round pick well came just last year in 2019, when they traded down with one of their first round picks and traded out of the first round entirely with the other, eventually going from having just 4 picks in the draft to having 11, even using a couple of those later round picks that they had traded for to trade back up in the second round and select DK Metcalf. But honestly, you could probably just ignore everything I just said and just look at it like this. The Seahawks just traded 2 late first-round picks for an early first-round talent who was actually selected 6th overall in 2017, so he still has plenty of years left. In fact, considering the development arc of a typical NFL player, he should just be hitting his prime now and still be getting better over the next couple of years, which, considering he was a first-team All-Pro last year, means that there could be some very good years ahead. And yes, if everything does pan out and Adams proves to be the level of player that we think he can be, and if the Seahawks want to keep him long-term, which a trade like this would definitely indicate that they do, they are going to have to pay him pretty handsomely, maybe even make him the highest paid safety in the history of the NFL. But at least for this year, both sides have agreed that he will remain on his rookie contract, which will see the Seahawks paying him $3.6 million. And it does make this year a prove-it year for him in Seattle, which in the past has proved to be a pretty good incentive for players to play at their absolute highest possible level. But of course, it wasn't just those 2 first-round picks that Seattle gave up. They also traded away Bradley McDougald, who in his last 2 years had 5 interceptions and 4 forced fumbles for the Seahawks, as well as in the 3 years he was with the Seahawks having 70 or more tackles in each season. So although he wasn't quite a headline player and definitely fell a little bit in the shadow of his predecessors in Cam Chancellor and Earl Thomas, he was still a very solid contributor for the Seahawks for 3 seasons. But the fact of the matter is here that even for as much as I really did like Bradley McDougald, with also recently acquired Quandre Diggs and the young promising Marquise Blair coming up, there really just wasn't enough space at safety to keep him while also acquiring Adams. So while I do think that by giving away McDougald, the Seahawks are giving away a good and honestly pretty underrated player, in the end it was just a necessary casualty from a roster perspective. Now that's all well and good, but this is still a heck of a price to pay for a safety, so he had better be worth it. But again, in my opinion anyways, it was absolutely worth it, because if Adams can play anywhere near the level he did especially last year, he's not just the type of player that can be a huge improvement at his position regardless of how the Seahawks choose to use him, he can be the type of player that improves all of those around him. Now, any Seahawks fan can tell you that it was pretty evident last year in 2019 just how much the team missed having a talent like Earl Thomas playing safety net for the defense, especially over the top. I'm certainly not going to tell you that Adams is the next Earl Thomas, although that is who he's going to be compared to for the next few years. But he does have that similar talent that can help him elevate, or as Russell Wilson would say, level up the players around him. For 9 years, and especially during the Legion of Boom era, us Seahawks fans grew accustomed to watching a defense that almost never gave up big plays, especially over the top, and got to watch some cornerback play that was aggressive, in your face, and had a lot of plays on the ball. All of which was due in large part to the talent of Earl Thomas. Now, of course, Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor were also playing at a Hall of Fame level while in Seattle, but even they would admit that a large part of the reason that they were able to play the way that they did was because that they trusted Earl Thomas would have their back. And to me at least, it was no accident that whatever corner was playing on the opposite side of Richard Sherman was usually playing at a Pro Bowl level, even while being targeted almost constantly because Sherman was on the other side. But then when they left Seattle, they just didn't quite play up to that same ability. Why? Because they didn't have Earl Thomas behind them. And that's probably the biggest reason of why I'm so happy with this trade for Jamal Adams, because while having a huge upgrade at safety is definitely a very nice thing to have, especially considering that Quinton Dunbar now finds himself on the commissioner's exempt list. It's what he could do for the 2 young corners that Seattle have in particular that has me so excited. Last year, even without Earl Thomas and with some pretty suspect safety play in his place, Shaquille Griffin still played very well and got himself to a Pro Bowl. But any Seahawks fan, and probably even Shaquille himself, would tell you that there's a number of plays that he probably left out on the field, and that was certainly even more exaggerated by his counterpart in Trey Flowers. And while it wasn't necessarily the exclusive problem, especially with Flowers, I do think the biggest part of what both of these guys struggled with was that they just didn't feel comfortable enough with making a play on the ball without having the safety net behind them to prevent a potential miss turning into a big play and a touchdown. In Shaquille's case, this would often mean that he would forego making a play on the ball in order to go for the safer just knocking the ball away or playing the receiver directly. It was a conservative play style born out of an apparent lack of trust in a safety net that was even more exaggerated, especially on the negative side in Trey Flowers' play. Because to me at least, it seemed like more often than not he was actually putting himself in a good position to make a play on the ball, but then at the last second seemed to have this habit of second guessing himself and ended up playing the receiver, either running into them and causing an obvious pass interference, or not looking back and just letting the ball go over him and ending up in big plays. It really did seem like for most of the season that both cornerbacks felt like they were completely on their own, and to some extent played like it. It was even obvious in the few games that Diggs did play for the Seahawks how much of a difference he made, because again, for as much as I did like McDougald, his one weakness was probably in coverage. And that's where I think a talent at safety like Adams could be a huge difference, providing that confidence that both of the corners seem to need in order to make more plays on the ball, which would inevitably lead to a considerable number of turnovers. Something that, to at least this point in both of their young careers, neither cornerback has been particularly good at causing. And while I do expect the difference at the safety position to be immediately obvious, I would say that with an abbreviated preseason and whatever is going to happen with COVID, especially with no preseason games, that the difference at cornerback position might take a little bit longer to develop as those guys get used to playing with each other. But by midseason, and especially as we get into later in the season and then eventually playoffs hopefully, that will look very different from how it did last year. Now, of course, the addition of Jamal Adams can't solve all of the Seahawks defensive problems, especially when you talk about defensive line and pass rush, especially if they can't get Jadeveon Clowney back. And yes, the Jets did not infrequently use Adams in blitz packages in order to get a little bit more pressure on the quarterback, but I wouldn't necessarily expect the Seahawks to do a whole lot of that. But even if the Seahawks don't use him directly to pressure the quarterback all that much, he could still definitely have a noticeable secondary impact on the pass rush. And again, if that does prove to be the case, it probably will get more obvious as the season goes along and the guys get used to playing with each other. But as is always the case, as the coverage improves and quarterbacks have to take longer and longer to throw, that gives the defensive line, which for the Seahawks admittedly is a bit lackluster, longer to get to the quarterback. Not to mention the fact that even towards the end of last season, we started to see the Seahawks use the linebackers a lot more in pass rush, which with an improved secondary is something they could definitely afford to continue doing. Now, admittedly, a lot of this is looking through a bit of an optimistic lens that is a little bit rose-tinted by having the excitement of another major free agent signing. And no, I'm not saying that we should be expecting to see anything close to the Legion of Boom Seahawks defenses, but I do think that this could be a major improvement for the Seahawks defense as a whole, and they could end up being much more of an above-average defense rather than a bottom-tier defense that they were last year. But of course, it is all speculation, and especially after last year, there's a lot of cynics when it comes to the Seahawks defense, so I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments section below of whether or not you thought this trade was worth it. But whether you liked this trade or you didn't, if you have made it to this point in the video, thank you very much for watching. If you did like it, hit that like button down below. If you really liked it and maybe even enjoyed it, hit that subscribe button. Otherwise, I hope to see you next time. Stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.